Will I get social housing or private rented accommodation when I make a homeless application? Now, this is a really key question. There's a lot of myths out there about it, and this is actually the third attempt I've made at recording a video to give this answer, and it gets really complicated and I've got things wrong in the past, so I'm just making sure that this is absolutely spot on. And in order to explain the answer to this, I'm going to give a hypothetical situation where I'm homeless because my house has burnt down. And the reason I use this example is it's nice and clear cut from a legal point of view. I'm homeless, I'm automatically in priority need, I'm a British national, I've lived here all my life, so I'm also eligible for assistance, and that just makes things a little bit easier just to navigate as we go through this answer. Now, in the situation, I'm homeless because my house has burnt down. I can approach any council in the country and make a homeless application, and any council I approach would have an interim duty to accommodate me under Section 188 of the Housing Act 1996. But pragmatically speaking, it's much more sensible to go to a council where I've got a local connection to in this instance, because there's no continued risk to me in this area, and therefore I might as well approach Bedford Borough Council, which is my local council. So I go to Bedford Borough Council, I say, hey, my house has burnt down, can you help me out with housing? I might be homeless and I've asked for housing assistance. So Section 184 is done. It also triggers, or it very quickly triggers, Section 188 of the Housing Act, which is that interim accommodation duty, because I've given the council reason to believe I might be homeless, might be eligible for assistance, and might have a priority need. So the council's duties commence, the inquiries commence. They need to check out a little bit more information about this to first of all work out whether I am indeed eligible for assistance. Once they're satisfied that I am, they then look at this question of whether I'm homeless, and again, that might be a case of speaking to the fire service or something to check the house has actually burnt down. And from that point, they're satisfied that I'm homeless and I'm eligible, therefore the relief duty kicks in. And to explain this as best I can, I need to explain a little bit about the history of housing law to explain how it is we've got to this point in time, because if nothing else, it is ridiculously convoluted. So back in 1996, there was the Housing Act 1996, and in that act, essentially, if you were owed the main housing duty, so if you were homeless, eligible, in priority needs, not intentionally homeless and had a local connection, you were owed the main housing duty, and councils could only discharge that duty through social housing, an offer of social housing on the housing register, or a direct offer, I guess, technically. And that was the way things were. And then 2011 comes along, and the Conservative coalition basically says there's not enough social housing around. We need to enable councils to be able to discharge that main housing duty into the private rented sector as well. So from the Localism Act 2011, essentially councils had the ability to discharge the main housing duty both into the social housing sector, but also the private rented sector if it was affordable, if it was suitable, if it was of a decent landlord, and crucially it had to be at least a 12-month assured short hold tenancy. So that's the way it was, and there were additional protections in place to mimic the security of tenure that you get through social housing. So for example, if the main housing duty was discharged into the private sector, if I was to become homeless again unintentionally within the next 2 years of that kind of discharge, then the council would still have to treat me as if I was in priority need, even if potentially I might have lost that priority need because this time my house hasn't burnt down. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the way the Localism Act worked. A few years later, 2017, the Homelessness Reduction Act came in, and it actually came in 2018. And that was when things started getting really complicated, because effectively, and I kind of get what they were trying to achieve from it, but crucially there was never going to be enough resources to really discharge these duties in the way, in the spirit it was intended. So you've basically got the introduction of this relief period and the prevention duty as well, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. We're going to use the simple example of a house having burnt down. And the relief duty enables councils to discharge duties to people and effectively end duties to people in ways other than the main housing duty, and that's where I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. So back to my situation, I'm homeless because of fire, I've made a homeless application, the council is satisfied I am eligible for assistance and I am in fact homeless, so the relief duty starts. And the first thing the council will need to do is carry out an assessment of effectively three things. Why did I become homeless? What type of accommodation I need in future, and do I need any support to maintain such accommodation? So those are the three questions that they need to ask. Once they've asked the questions, or once they've got answers to those questions, they would then collaborate with me to form what's called a personalised housing plan. So just to make the point, the relief duty does not start as soon as the homeless application is triggered. It could be sometime later if it's a particularly complicated situation, but it shouldn't really be. It should only be a few days, I'd have thought, at most, before the council can get to that point. And then they have a number of options, and this is where it gets really complicated. The council has a number of options in this relief duty, which should only last for 56 days, but can often extend far beyond that because councils aren't dealing with things properly. They've maybe got 5 different ways they can end that relief duty through an offer of housing, and they don't use kind of jargon around some of this, which is why I've certainly found it quite difficult to understand. But I'm going to start with the nice easy stuff. So I'm in the relief period, I made a homeless application, the relief duty's kicked off, I've got a personalised housing plan, and the council can first of all make a final offer of accommodation, and there's two ways that they can do that. One is a final Part 6 offer, which would be essentially an offer of social housing, which I don't have a whole lot of say about where it is, so I don't get to go on the housing register and bid necessarily. They could just literally present it and say, this is a final Part 6 offer, assuming it's suitable, so assuming it is genuinely suitable, it's affordable, it's in a suitable location and so on. If I was to refuse that offer, the council can end the homeless application effectively for me altogether. And I do have a right to request a review of the suitability, but any sensible person would move into that accommodation, however unsuitable it might be, and then request a review of it rather than basically playing chicken with the local authority and just basically saying I'm not going to move in, because there is a very real danger, and the council would have to explain this in writing that this is the case, the consequence of doing this. But if they have done that and then you proceed to decline that offer of accommodation, everything stops. So that council no longer owes you any duties under the Housing Act other than advice and assistance, unless your circumstances were to significantly change in terms of something relevant changing, at which point you can make a fresh application to the same local authority, or you could potentially approach a different local authority as well. But this decision to turn down that offer of so-called suitable accommodation might come back to bite you that way as well. So you've got this final Part 6 offer, and similarly you've got something called a final accommodation offer, which is not a very good term for it if you ask me. It should be called something like a final private accommodation offer or something like that. But essentially it's an offer of suitable accommodation in the private rented sector, but this time it only needs to be a 6-month tenancy rather than a 12-month assured short hold tenancy. And so you can see kind of the security of tenure of these options have been watered down in successive acts of parliament. So that's the second thing. So final Part 6 offer, final accommodation offer. They can then make what I'm going to call an informal offer of accommodation, and this is where things get really complicated. So that as well as making a final Part 6 offer or a final accommodation offer, they could essentially try to find me some other type of accommodation which is likely to be available for me for at least 6 months, and that could be simply something like supported accommodation, like a YMCA or something, or it could be some kind of arrangement with a family member where there is a realistic prospect that it would last for at least 6 months. And this is the bit that gets complicated, because in theory I can turn that down and that doesn't necessarily end all duties to me. So let's say they say to me, hey, we've spoke to your mum, she says she's got a room for you, she's happy with you living there for 6 months, therefore this is an offer of accommodation, it's suitable and so on. I could at that point say no thanks, I don't want that. And then one of two things might happen, and as I say, pay attention to the detail here. One of the things is the council might say, fair enough, we're not going to make you go in there, we understand why you have made that decision, and effectively nothing really happens. The relief duty continues as it would have otherwise done. But they could at that point say that I've unreasonably refused to cooperate with the personalised housing plan by refusing that offer of so-called suitable accommodation, the informal offer as I'm calling it. And this is where things get really complicated. If they're going to say that, if they're going to go through that process and say I've unreasonably refused to cooperate, the relief duty ends immediately, and then the council will issue basically a Section 184 decision into whether they owe me the main housing duty or not. And for me, as someone whose house has burnt down, in one sense it's straightforward. They are going to owe me that main housing duty, so they will have a duty to provide me housing. But because I'm deemed to have not cooperated with that personalised housing plan, they don't have to give me the main housing duty as it would otherwise be. So they don't have to give me kind of access to the housing register, and they don't have to give me a 12-month assured short hold tenancy. They can in effect simply give me a final Part 6 offer or a final accommodation offer as they could have done in the relief period in general. So I'm not saying they will do that, because actually it's quite difficult, it's quite a lot of work involved to make that argument that you've unreasonably refused to cooperate. But if they were to do that, turning down this informal offer could be used against you and could in effect water down that final main housing duty to you. So that's kind of something that could happen. Equally, in the relief period, the council doesn't have to do anything. It could just essentially let the relief duty run. When it gets to day 57, they end the relief duty, and then they're going to issue the Section 184 decision into whether they owe me the main housing duty or not. At that point, they could also decide that I'm owed the Section 190 duty to people who are in priority needs but who are actually intentionally homeless. So let's say, for example, they carried out inquiries and it turned out that I'd been the one that set the fire to my house. So although I'm in priority needs, I'm also going to be intentionally homeless. So I'm probably also going to be in trouble with the police, but let's just leave that aside for a second. And in that case, where you're in priority need but you are intentionally homeless, the council only has to house you for a period of time that gives you a reasonable opportunity to secure something else, which typically will be something like 28 days or something. So that's something that can happen. But as I say, in a situation where I'm going to be owed the main housing duty but I'm deemed to have unreasonably refused to cooperate with the personalised housing plan, it effectively means I cannot get that proper main housing duty and instead get this lesser offer of a final accommodation offer or a final Part 6 offer. So I'm hoping I've covered the main bases there. I'm actually working on a flowchart at the moment, which I'm going to publish at some point and probably do a separate video about it to kind of explain how these different things work in a way which is a little bit more graphic and kind of hopefully is a bit more easy to understand. But as I say, the headlines are in terms of, do you get social housing or do you get private rented? The answer is there is no guarantee either way. Even if you're going to be owed the main housing duty, that still does not guarantee you social housing. The council can legitimately discharge those duties into the private rented sector, either through a final accommodation offer in the relief period or through an offer of a 12-month assured or a tenancy in that main housing duty stage. And there's not a lot you can do about that other than ensure that you are cooperating fully with their inquiries and their admin processes. So in one sense, if you are very quick to provide all the documents that are needed to get you onto the housing register, then that does increase your chances of getting social housing. If you literally stick your head in the sand, you don't provide what they ask for, when it comes to the end of that relief duty, they might just say, well, hey, do you know what, Mike's not made any effort here to get on the housing register, we can't be bothered to chase him, we're simply going to look for private rented accommodation because that's going to be the easiest way to get rid of them. There's also other situations which would increase the chance of getting private rented accommodation. So for example, couples without children are more likely to get private rented accommodation as a discharge of the main housing duty or in the relief period through a final accommodation offer, because there are two incomes in effect, even if it's universal credit, there is more scope to pay those utility bills and all that kind of stuff that comes with it rather than a single person. And so because private rented accommodation tends to be more unaffordable than social housing, because there's two of you, it's more likely it is going to be affordable, and therefore it's more likely you're going to get a discharge into the private rented sector. So that's something to bear in mind. The other thing that makes things even more complicated at this point, and it is probably worth saying at this point, is that if you are owed a duty under Part 7 of the Housing Act, which is everything to do with homeless applications, as in either prevention duty, relief periods, duties further down the line, you are given what's called reasonable preference, which is another bit of jargon, and basically what it means is you should be able to get onto the housing register. And this is where you'll need to check out your local housing allocation scheme, which you can just Google, Bedford Borough Council housing allocation scheme, and then look at the bit of that policy which covers the banding, because what you find is different councils deal with this very differently. You have to get some banding if you are owed the relief duty, owed the prevention duty, or one of those latter duties as well, but you're likely to get a lower banding, except some councils do still give you a high banding. So some councils do still try and give you band A, band B, 1 or 2 or gold or silver or whatever, in those situations to give you a realistic prospect of getting accommodation whilst you're still in the relief or prevention periods. It's not likely, but there are some areas where waiting lists are not so ridiculous. So if you're in London, that's never going to happen in a million years, because you're just not going to compete with people who are in the top bands. But in other areas you might find that is still useful, and that would apply to you whether you're intentionally homeless or whatever. If you're owed that relief or that prevention duty, you can still get on the housing register and you can still bid, and in some probably quite rare cases that will be enough to actually win a bid and get somewhere before the council gets to that point of reaching a final decision. Now, I've mentioned that relief period should only last for 56 days. That's what the law says, or the code of guidance, which is essentially the way council should interpret the law. What it basically says is that if you made a homeless application, the relief duties kicked in, then the council should reach that final decision on day 57, except where there are exceptionally complicated circumstances, in which case the council can take another 3 weeks, so 11 weeks in total, something like that. what you find is that some councils, because they're overwhelmed, they haven't got enough staff, and they don't have enough staff because they haven't employed enough staff. It's a political decision. It's not that it's kind of like some act of God. But because the council leaders, because the politicians haven't ensured their homelessness services are properly resourced, they don't have enough staff, and therefore you have situations where people end up being in the relief period for over a year sometimes. And that can sometimes be in their advantage. If they're on the housing register, they've got reasonable preference, that might give them enough time to bid. But in most cases, it's just going to leave you in this limbo period where it's no use to anyone. So in that situation, what we say to people is, if you are, if the relief duty has ended and the council officer is not getting back to you, is not responding, is not making that final decision, you should then complain to the chief exec and ensure hopefully a more rapid response to it. So that's just something to bear in mind. And the example I gave about someone whose house has burnt down, I use that example because it's nice and simple. It gets more complicated when you're going to be, when you're someone who would be in priority need because of some kind of vulnerability where it's not automatic. So let's say I became homeless, Section 21 notice, no fault eviction, and I had depression, I had anxiety, and maybe had suicidal ideation or something. I would very much be in the ballpark of being in priority need through vulnerability, but it's not guaranteed. And that changes that decision process that you need to make in the relief period, because when you get that informal offer of accommodation, so let's say the council does in fact try to find you a supported accommodation unit and kind of move you in there, I could say, well, okay, I don't want to move in there, I'm going to wait to see what happens with the main housing duty. But that runs the risk that they're going to make a negative decision and say that I'm not in priority need, at which point I'm going to have to go through the review process and probably get more medical information to actually fight it. So just to finish up, I'm going to give an example of where this kind of worked in practice. A few years ago I was working for Just Us in Bedford, and I was working with a guy. He had osteoarthritis and PTSD, really bad symptoms. He was under the pain clinic and kind of had loads of medication and stuff that went with it. So I knew from day one that although it was not automatic, it was highly likely he was going to be in priority need. So he made a homeless application and the relief duty kicked in, and the council tried to refer him to a local charity supported accommodation unit. And I said to him, look, go to the interview for that supported accommodation, see what they say, and then have a conversation with them if they accept you, to ask them to hold that bed space open for you until you receive that final decision. And that's exactly what happened. So basically he went to the charity, they accepted him, but then we had the conversation with the charity and said, look, we think it's highly likely he's going to be owed the main housing duty. Can you just hold this bed space open, or can you keep him top of the list, should the council try and say he's not in priority need down the line, which they were happy to. We waited the relief period out, and sure enough they made a positive decision. We had to go through a review process to get it, because initially they said he wasn't in priority need, but we won that review. He was in fact in priority need. He was therefore owed the main housing duty, and he moved into social housing shortly afterwards, maybe only after a couple of months. Whereas if he'd have just gone with that first offer, he would have been in supported accommodation for a couple of years. Much worse kind of living conditions for many people, depending on the project. Obviously some places are okay, but for most people they would much prefer to have their own social housing tenancy with their own front door key, control over who comes to their accommodation, not having to deal with staff members, that sort of thing. And actually that was a far better option for him. But there needed to be some careful planning around how these duties kick in, so that we didn't put him in a situation where he didn't engage with the charity. The council then said he's unreasonably refusing to cooperate, and that really could have resulted in him not being owed any duty at all and being left homeless. So we had to play that incredibly carefully, and I only did it because I was sure that this guy was definitely in priority need through vulnerability, because of the symptoms he was having, because of the fact he couldn't stand up in the morning, the really kind of severe arthritis that he was experiencing. In that situation, that was the kind of way to play it. But for those who are less clear cut in terms of vulnerability, so where the symptoms aren't as pronounced, where you don't have that medical information backing up, ultimately you might be in a situation where you do just need to accept those offers of, those informal offers of accommodation that are in the relief period, so that you don't then end up in a situation where you have nothing at all. But as I say, in most situations charities should be understanding of that situation you're in, and they should work with you to, if they're going to accept you, keep you high on the waiting list, so that actually they might be able to kind of catch you if the council then ends all duties to you down the line. So I'm hoping that makes sense. Please do ask questions in the chat. If any of that didn't make sense, I'll try and reiterate it. But that's so far the best way I can explain the relief period and these different offers of accommodation that you might get in that period. So as I say, for final accommodation offers, final Part 6 offers, main housing duty, you just need to accept them, and if they're really unsuitable then you need to challenge it through the existing review process. But what you do not ever want to do is be in a situation where you just refuse to move into it altogether, because the council can then end that duty, end the temporary accommodation, and then your only option is to win the review process, which is not guaranteed. Suitability is notoriously difficult to argue. You're probably going to need a solicitor, and even then it isn't guaranteed, so you could really be kind of shooting yourself in the foot in that situation. Whereas it's slightly different for those informal offers of accommodation, so those, you know, staying with family arrangements, staying in supported accommodation, because actually there is a little bit more leeway in terms of negotiating with that and holding off for a better offer down the line. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. It hurts my head just thinking about it. It just reminds me of why I don't like the Homelessness Reduction Act at all. But this is the law we've got at the moment, so it is what it is. If you find this stuff useful, do check out the weekly live stream every Thursday at 7:30. If you subscribe to the channel, you'll get a notification when we're going live, because we do other events as well, and we do put other videos up, so just do keep an eye out on that. And as ever, do like the video if you want to. Do check out our online training. We go into a lot of detail about things like priority needs, local connection, intentional homelessness, the definition of homelessness, and that should hopefully give you a good grounding in terms of, you know, being able to support people who are homeless so that they can make use of the law. And just to make the point finally, the law is there to be of assistance. It's not supposed to be a case of let's see how we can block people from getting housed. A lot of good people fought for that law to be as good as it is, and it makes no sense whatsoever just to allow councils to get away with just misapplying it and not discharging their duties lawfully. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.